obviously, as you know, because you're in the room, the title is Extending Observability of the Application Lifecycle with Argo, Flux, and Keptn. Now, as you can probably see, Anna Medina is not here. She can't make it for reasons outside of her control, so she sends her apologies, and you've got me instead. So, yeah, as I say, the CD Foundation and the CNCF ambassador. I spent about 9 years in the observability space. So that's my technical background. I've said I'm a DevRel at Dynatrace. And observability, security, and progressive delivery are my interests and my focus areas professionally. And then outside of work, anything to do with the ocean, on it, in it, under it, scuba diving. The two photos there, by the way, they're me on Slack. I signed up to Slack with my personal and my work email, and I cannot for the life of me figure out which is which. So there are two photos, both of them are me. So if you find either of those, it's me. All right, so this is, Keptn, of course, is an open source project. This is not a product. So I'm looking for a bit of kind of user feedback or room feedback here. So I'm going to put 3 observability challenges on here that we have seen, and I just want a nod or a shake for each one of them. Because as a project, we really need to make sure that we're obviously addressing the concerns and the problems that you're really having. So the first is observability tool sprawl. We'd all love it to have a single tool to go for our metrics. That's not the case. In an enterprise, you'll have Prometheus and Dynatrace and another Prometheus instance and Splunk and so on and so forth. So that's problem number 1. How do we get a unified view and treat that data in a unified manner? The second is, when we make a change, how do we actually measure that? Tools like Argo are very, very good at doing a deployment, but how do we actually measure whether that worked and whether it was successful? And then the third is taming the integration complexity. The talks that I've heard the last 2 days have all been about, we're maintaining this point-to-point integration with this tool, and then we build it again with another tool, and so on and so forth. So challenge number 1, the observability tool sprawl. Just kind of give me a nod or a shake, a yes or a no, if that's an issue for you. Yes, yes, lots of nods. Okay. So the solution that we have come up with, of course, is the Keptn metrics server. Basically, think conceptually about the metrics server as a cache that lives on your cluster. What it will do is it will sit as an operator on your cluster, and you define your endpoints of where your metrics are. They could be Prometheus, they could be Dynatrace, they could be Datadog or Splunk or wherever. The metrics server will go out and retrieve those metrics from that solution and pull them into the metrics server, as I say, like a cache. And then once they're in there, you can treat those all the same. You can just say, get me a Keptn metric. You don't really care where the metric actually came from. Now, of course, that opens up a lot of other stuff and other capabilities like HPA and CADA. So you can drive those tools with the Keptn metrics. And this is what it looks like. So you have a kubectl get Keptn metrics, and you can see there we're pulling one from the provider Dynatrace and one from Prometheus. And again, you don't care where those metrics came from. How do you actually define that? What does it look like in YAML? You won't be surprised to know there is a custom resource behind this. That's top one there is the Prometheus. So you have a provider, and then you give it your query. And obviously the query is tool specific. So the query for Dynatrace will be different to, the Prometheus query. You can also see there, you can define the fetch interval seconds. So they're both 10, but you can say, well, fetch the metrics from Prometheus, or fetch this metric from Prometheus every 60 seconds. So there's that flexibility as well. And then that's just an example of how it could actually be used with HPA. Here you're saying, well, I've got HPA. Here's my metric, my availability SLO, and I'm pulling it from a kind Keptn metric, and here's my target value. And if not, HPA will then scale accordingly. Again, remember that most of what I've talked about is the plumbing. As a user, you're just going to be looking at this right-hand YAML saying, get me a metric. You shouldn't care where it came from. That's the abstraction that the Keptn metric server provides. Challenge number 2. I made a change and, well, great, now what? Argo, Flux has applied the change, but yeah, so what? What do we do with it? How do I see whether that was good or bad? The Lifecycle toolkit gives you full observability of everything that happens on your cluster at the deployment level because it emits OpenTelemetry metrics and OpenTelemetry traces. So as Argo does a sync, we build an OpenTelemetry trace of what that looks like. And I'll show you that in a moment. And then, of course, there are graphing solutions like Grafana. You can build dashboards for your DORA metrics because, of course, if we are wrapping, if Keptn is in that deployment process, we know how many deployments you've done. We know how many failed. We know the time it took to do the deployment because we've got the OpenTelemetry trace. And at the bottom there, of course, is the actual OpenTelemetry trace. And I'll zoom in on that a little bit later. And the third one is this idea of point-to-point integrations and trying to solve that problem. So you've got test tools, you've got security tools, you've got your SLO validations. Am I allowed to deploy? Is the infrastructure healthy enough? And all of these are kind of, you have to maintain them. And Keptn is trying to solve that with the concept of Keptn tasks. So this is an example of a Keptn task. At the moment, Keptn only supports JavaScript, and it runs via the Deno or Dino runtime engine. As you can see there, you write these tasks, so they can do anything you want. Now, an evaluation looks like that. Obviously, again, a CRD, where you give it an objective, a Keptn metric, as I described earlier, like available CPUs. You give it an evaluation target, and then basically you link that into your deployment via annotations, and it either passes or it fails. And if it fails, of course, we're not going to do the deployment. So how do you get those top 2 YAMLs into your actual process? Well, it's very simple. It's just a case of labeling up your deployment manifest. So here what you're seeing is annotations that say, pre-deployment, we're going to do these evaluations. So these are things like checking our third-party systems are healthy, our dependencies are healthy, our infrastructure is healthy, whatever conditions must exist before you're allowed to deploy that app. Maybe it's a maintenance window. Then we trigger the pre-deployment tasks. And in this case, it's whatever you've written, but let's say we're going to notify someone on Slack that that's going to happen. Then we do this exact same 2 steps post-deployment. So after the pod is scheduled, you have the ability to run your own tasks, like notify that the deployment was successful, or rollback, or whatever the case might be. All right, enough slides. Let's see this. So this is the Grafana dashboard that comes sort of out of the box when you install Keptn and the observability piece. The Lifecycle toolkit comes as a Helm chart, and then of course you need something like Jaeger or Dynatrace to actually visualize those traces. You need a dashboard solution like Grafana. But the actual metrics, the DORA metrics, are emitted by the Lifecycle toolkit. So there's nothing to configure there. Now down the bottom, if I zoom in a little bit, we also see a list of traces. Now, as you can probably guess, this trace is a deployment. It is an OpenTelemetry trace of a deployment. Now, if I zoom in, what you'll see is there are two, sort of just the shape of things, there are two sections here. There's your application, and then we kind of go into the tree, and you've got your workloads. So think about your workloads as your deployment YAMLs, and the application is a concept in Keptn, a CRD called a Keptn app. And what that CRD does is it allows you to say, this set of deployments is logically to be considered an application. Now, all of those workloads, those checks that I was talking about, happen on both the workload level and the application level. So not only can you test your microservices, whether they're individually healthy, but at the end of all of that, is my application as a whole healthy? Because it's no good saying, well, yes, my cart service is okay, and they unit tests really at the workload level, and then you go to the application level and say, can my user do the thing they need to do? And that's what you're seeing in this tree view. So we go into the pre-deployed tasks. This long one here is actually the deployment. So this is Argo applying the deployment. And then we do the same thing at the end with the post tasks. So how does this actually work? Well, we start by installing the toolkit. Now, it's important to say it is a toolkit. So if you like the sound of the OpenTelemetry traces and metrics, you can have that bit. If you'd like the combination of metric server, you can have just that bit. So you can pick and choose which parts of this you want, but ultimately you have to annotate your namespace. That is saying, that's going to say to Keptn, okay, start taking notice of this namespace. So this is the application namespace. Then we have a completely standard deployment manifest, nothing special at all, apart from we've put in some, I'm not sure why this is commented out, but it works with app as well. So 3 labels, app, or name, version, and part of. Now the part of is the application level. The name is the workload. So those 3 annotations are what drive the toolkit. Those 3 are really the only thing you need, because that's the information we need to build that picture. What is our workload? Well, that's the name. What application does it belong to? That's the part of. And what is the version of that? That's the version. And that's it. That's basically it. So you run with Flux or Argo or whatever tool you currently use, and the Lifecycle toolkit just hooks into that deployment and does the rest for you. How are we doing for time? 3:02, good. This is a sample of a Keptn task definition. So as you can see, this is inline, so you can actually write anything you like. Now, as long as these tasks exit with a 0, Keptn says that was successful, fantastic, on we go with our day. If they exit with anything other than 0, obviously that's indicating an error. Now, if your pre-deployment tasks fail, so let's say you're trying to do a deployment and you go out and check your third parties. They are unhealthy for whatever reason. And you've done that as a pre-deployment. Your workload will never pass. It will never be deployed. It will stay in a pending state, and that is by design, because what you're saying there is my third parties have to be healthy, otherwise I know my application is going to be unhealthy. Now, post tasks, of course, the deployment, the pod is already scheduled. So if a post task fails, the worst that's going to happen there is, you're not going to get your notification in Slack, for example. So what about the Keptn evaluations? Sorry, I'll show you one other thing, which is, I missed a part. How do we get the pre and post evaluations to actually trigger and actually work in the lifecycle. Again, they're just annotations. So here we're saying Keptn.sh pre-deployment evaluation. Evaluate my dependencies. Pre-deployment tasks. Notify someone via Slack or webhook or whatever the case might be that we're about to start the deployment, and then do the same thing afterwards. So this is what a Keptn evaluation looks like. Again, completely GitOps compatible. We have called it evaluate dependencies. Now remember back here, this is how it ties in. So that's the name of the object. So that's how they tie together. And we have a Keptn metric reference. As you saw, the metric server, evaluate CPUs, and we have an evaluation target. And that's partly why we've built the Keptn metric server, because we didn't want to pollute this with the idea of providers. We don't want to have, because remember, different teams are probably going to be setting this up in a large enterprise. So one team is going to be looking at the metrics and the thresholds. Another team is going to be looking at the providers. So we didn't want to have you to have to know, well, this metric comes from Prometheus and this one from Dynatrace and so on and so forth. You can treat that transparently. I guess I really want to open the floor to questions because I know the Lifecycle toolkit is new to a lot of you. But actually, that's a good question. How many are new to the toolkit? How many had only just heard about this now? Okay, good. Hopefully there'll be questions. So in summary, the three big capabilities are a unified way to access observability data. They're the Keptn metrics. So no matter where you're coming from, what tools your metrics come from, that's the Keptn metrics server. As you saw, all of this is generating DORA metrics and OpenTelemetry traces, sort of quote unquote, out of the box. That's the Lifecycle toolkit. That is what's wrapping your deployment. Now, it's important to mention that it is at the cluster level. So Keptn is completely agnostic to Flux or Argo or kubectl apply or however you decide to do that deployment. Keptn doesn't really care because it's actually a pod scheduler extension that's when it starts, is when the pod is actually beginning to be scheduled. And of course, I talked about the idea of tasks, custom tasks, and the SLO evaluations. And all of this, of course, as you've seen, happens natively in Kubernetes with CRDs. Questions?
So the question is, how does the lifecycle controller find out the time to recovery metric? Because I guess a version would change there. Is it the whole application that it looks at, just part of it? And so what's considered an incident, and when is that remediated?
Yeah, that actually, I'm very glad you asked that. That brings up two areas that we need assistance from the community with, and advice and opinions on is exactly that, time to recovery, but also promotions between environments. Because what I've just described there is I'm deploying a set of YAML files. That is an area that is under active discussion, so if that's of interest, please do join the community, get involved, have your opinion, etc., etc.
So when the application is initialized for deployment, so metrics are not available for application. how do we set the life cycle, let's say, for healthy recovery or healthy deployment?
So let me show you the definition of a Keptn application. Now, this step is actually, it's recommended, but it's technically optional. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying I've got a logical application called Simple App. It's in this, sorry, I don't know if that's still working. It's in this namespace. The application has a version 1.0.2, and it has a set of workloads, and each of those workloads has a different version. Now, it's recommended to do this, obviously, with GitOps. You want to be declarative, but if not, my belief is that the Lifecycle toolkit will basically look at the annotations on your deployment manifests and build this for you. So that's how you define an application. And then you can also decide your pre and post evaluations and tasks at the application level in this YAML file. Your question was more around the health of an application. So the toolkit hooks into the scheduler. So the first time the toolkit really cares is when the pod is about to be scheduled. And we basically say, no, wait a minute. We know you're trying to schedule some pods, but let's go and do some tests and tasks and evaluations first. If they pass, go ahead, Kubernetes, and schedule the pods. That's fine. So does that answer your question, or not really?
No, that answers, but maybe to be more specific, so application, I mean, the pre-deployment checks can check for compute resources or, let's say, memories availability is there or not. How about those scenarios where we want to set up, let's say, ingress route and the controller is down? Does it check the availability of the route? I mean, can we have that capability?
The short answer is yes. Have we got time? Yeah, we've got time. Okay. So in that scenario, you would mix the two concepts. Remember, you've got your evaluations that pull from the Keptn metric server. So the first thing is, are some metrics available in the Keptn metric server that we could pull and judge? If they are, perfect. If not, then remember you've kind of fall back to the tasks. And those tasks are just JavaScript. So now the world's your oyster. You can do whatever you like. As long as that task exits with a 0, you're signaling to Keptn that it's so that's using a task would be how you would reach out to a CDN if the CDN didn't have metrics and say, are you still available before I do my deployment? You do, a fetch. You'd make sure their endpoint is up, all good. The mic's closer.
I got the mic first.
Oh, yes, you did.
Is there like a distributed way to run Keptn at sort of like a management cluster level? Or is there architectural preference for that?
Not that I'm aware of. The only deployment models I've seen at the moment are, a single cluster, because you deploy the toolkit per cluster. I'd be very interested in working on a multi-cluster setup, a multi-region, multi-cluster, I guess, setup, and even having that, a Grafana dashboard to visualize that. That would be fantastic. I'd love to have that. Yeah. So short answer, no, not yet, but let's connect and build that. Yep.
Would the pre and post deployment evaluation also trigger for upgrades if I update the deployment definition with a new image, for example?
Yes. Well, yes and no. So it works on the version. So you have to bump the versions in your deployment, which you'd probably be doing anyway in reality. So yes, as soon as that version is upgraded, because what I haven't shown is behind the scenes, obviously, as soon as we start this process, we set up a load of custom resources on the cluster. So you can say kubectl get Keptn apps and it'll show you the current version, it'll show you the previous versions, and so yes, it does.
So I have to bump the version of the Keptn app. It's not enough to change just the deployment, or the deployment spec.
No, just the workload.
Okay.
Yep. Any more? Any more for any more? No? Cool. So now, I got the nod or the shake at the beginning. Now that I've said that, said all of that, do the 3 pain points, does this sound viable, or as a project, are we fundamentally missing something here? Are we missing a problem that this solution could solve? Fantastic. Everyone's tired. There's been a lot of talks. I should have got you all to stand up and do some sort of...
2 out of the 3 check the box with me.
Okay, which 2? Or which one isn't?
2.
The first 2?
Yeah.
Okay.
I got already seen the metric server and the lifecycle control as well. Tasks, I don't know. It might be just personal preference, but tasks just doesn't. I don't feel like that's the.
Yeah.
But I haven't tried them yet.
No. What I think, being here and hearing projects like Ortelius, we could have tasks that push and notify into their repository to say you've got a new version. You know, after a deployment, here's the image and the SHA. Go and stick that into your registry, or even just notifications. I don't. I was talking to the Keptn folk today. Maybe we trigger a Keptn task. So the possibilities are endless, really.
And like filing a bug or something. Essentially, when a test fails, you could automate the creation of a work item or something like that. I do want to say one thing that really caught my attention with Keptn over the last couple of months has been the integration with trace test.
Yes.
And seeing that adds a very visual layer. And I'm I guess my question here is, with the lifecycle controller and the metric server, do the trace tests that run essentially with Keptn, do those show up in the same metrics capacity, or do you see them in sort of the open telemetry like door metrics as well?
So we've built. How are we doing for time? Oh, good. We've built trace test. I'm in contact with the trace test, so they're a fantastic team. And if you haven't seen trace test, definitely check it out. But we built it for version 1, Keptn version 1, which is a completely different thing to this. We haven't yet embarked on that journey of building it for the Lifecycle toolkit. But I think it would be a task, and potentially a task that then pushes metrics into the Keptn metrics server, and then you can do evaluations on it. So yes, I think we haven't solutioned it yet, to be honest, but I think, and it makes sense, right? It makes sense to have all of this in one place. So because your trace tests, and it's not just trace test, other vendors, Datadog, Dynatrace will want to pull traces from their backends and evaluate traces as well.
Yeah, I guess that is like the other problem with trace test, which is that it is not multi-cluster or done at sort of like a management level. It really has to be run next to the application. So because of that, it's kind of the same thing here, right? Yeah. It's like, unless you're forwarding your telemetry data into an hotel collector, into some other centralized observability plane, you're not really visualizing or seeing it from like a hub and spoke model.
Exactly. Please do, I've just had the 1 minute sign, so please do sign up to the Slack and raise these questions and thoughts. This is exactly why the community is so powerful. So thank you very much, everyone. And yeah.